And I remember how many people, this was particularly in Europe, were very adverse to risk. Now, I say this, and I come from a totally European family, carry an EU passport, and my parents were as European as you could get. And one of the things I did when we started a magazine called Wired Magazine, about 15 years ago, was I wrote a story called Why Europe is So Unwired. And my father was alive at the time, and he really didn't like the story. And so I was visiting him at Christmas. They were living in Switzerland at the time. And he said to me at dinner, he said, you know, that story was all wrong. Now, we had a rather formal relationship, and I said, well, let's talk about it after dinner. So after dinner, we went through the story and had bullet points. And the first bullet point was there was too much centralism, and that a wired and innovative society needed to be much more decentralized. And he said, no, we're very decentralized in Europe, and centralism is not an issue. Well, he was my father, and I wasn't going to argue he was wrong, but I wasn't going to tell him that, so we went on to the next point. And the next point was that there wasn't any risk capital, that there wasn't a propensity to take risk. And he said, no, my banker friends in Brussels all take risk, and they have, an attitude toward risk. And I said, no, this is not going to go anywhere. So I went through all the points, and the last point, was Europeans don't listen to their young. And he looked at me and said, why should we? And we both laughed, and the point being, that is also very much part of it. When people look to the United States and they say, boy, it's so encouraging of entrepreneurship, well, one of the reasons is we listen to our young much more than has traditionally been the case in Europe and other countries. So, having said that, I'm going to describe a particular project that I've been doing, and it's occupied me 150% of my time for the past 4 years, but it goes way back. It goes back to 1968. I was a young faculty member at MIT, and a man named Seymour Papert had come from Switzerland, where he was working with Jean Piaget, and had come to MIT to be one of the 2 co-directors of the Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. And Seymour's interest was how children learned. And he made an observation in 1968 that if children, young children, were able to write computer programs, that would be the closest that a child could come to thinking about thinking. And what's so important about writing a program is that it never works the first time. And so it does something, but it's not what you wanted it to do. So you look at what it did, you go back, you correct the program, and finally you get it to do what you wanted it to do. And that process is called debugging. And debugging is, in fact, the closest you can come to learning about learning. Now, this may sound very abstract, but the picture on the screen, quite a bit later, 1982, is a child outside of Dakar in Senegal who doesn't speak English or French, just speaks Wolof, who was using an Apple II computer that we had started to put in that particular district before the IBM PC existed. There was no Microsoft, there was no PC. And what we learned when we were doing this project way back then we were also doing it in Pakistan and Colombia, was that these children played with those laptops like pianos. There was no difference between that child and a child in suburban United States. Now, those projects didn't get much traction. It was before the internet was available to accept a very few number of people, and it certainly didn't reach into Africa, most of Asia, and South America. 20 years later, fate plays a role in most of our lives. At the time, my son was living in Italy, and he was having girlfriend problems and startup company problems. He tried to start a company in Italy, which is hard, and it didn't succeed. And so I said to him, his name is Dimitri, I said, Dimitri, if you can suffer the indignity of working for your father, why don't you go to Cambodia, where your mother and I have built a school, which I had done just as a charitable act. And we had built a school, for a long story, that was just a school, and I thought, why not connect it to the internet, and Dimitri could distribute laptops and do the things that he had learned his whole life, because when he was born, Seymour Papert was very much part of our family. So Dimitri goes and sets this up. This is in a village in 2001. This is in a village that has an average income of 30 euros per year. Not per month, per year. No electricity, no telephone, no television, and there's subsequent villages, a couple of which had no road. You couldn't get there in the rainy season. And what he did was quite remarkable. Every child you see in this image, their first English word is Google. When they took the laptops home, because they were charged at school with a generator, the same one that runs the satellite in the background, the parents were thrilled because when the child opened up the laptop, it was the brightest light source in the house. It illuminated the house. And I looked at that picture and I said, what in that picture will not happen with normal market forces? What can we do as a small group of people that could change the course of industry and maybe change the course of learning and maybe even change the course of poverty? And there are many elements in that picture. I'll pick one, the telecommunications piece, for which there's a lot of parallel efforts happening. Wi-Fi, WiMAX, 3G, different technologies that one could argue have a momentum. The regulatory regimes are changing, prices are going down, that it will continue in a positive direction without much intervention. But I looked at the laptop, and what I saw in the laptop was a phenomenon that we can now explain very simply as the DNA of electronics. And by that I mean that the cost of electronics, in general, electronics in this thing, electronics in a cell phone, drops, in rough numbers, 50% every 2 years. So if I know that the cost of making, let's say, a laptop, or at least the electronics in the laptop, will be 50% cheaper 2 years from now, I, as a manufacturer, have to, between now and then, add so many features that when the time comes, I can keep this on the market at roughly the same price.